I have the honor to introduce our first speaker for this morning. We do have a wonderful array of speakers for the day. I hope you're looking forward to that both this morning and after lunch. The speakers and also the workshop leaders, facilitators that we have lined up. And our first this morning is Martin Palmer. Martin Palmer is a theologian, sinologist, author, and international specialist on all major faiths and religious traditions and cultures. He's known to many through the written word and the spoken word, through his 20-plus books and his many segments on BBC radio and television. Among other things, he is the founding president and chief executive of Faith Invest, an international not-for-profit which challenges and empowers faith groups to invest in line with their values, to practice what they preach, in other words. Hence his subject for this morning, from statements to stakeholders, turning great statements into great action. We are pleased that along with his prepared remarks, he has agreed to engage in an exchange of questions and answers at the end of his time. It was a delight for us to have Martin as part of an online Corrymeela program last year, and all the more grateful are we to have him here in person. Please join me in welcoming Martin Palmer.
Trip over the wire. It's a fantastic start. Well, good morning, everybody. Oh, that's nice. So if you were Anglicans, you'd be going to go and mess up. Who is this man? Why is he speaking? So it's really nice to have a response like that. Sharon, thank you for sponsoring this and for the bag. Yes. I've actually brought a cloth one, so I'm going to swap it round. But thank you, and Alex and the whole community here, and there are others who've made this such a wonderful journey to get here. Like everything else, I'm delighted. I mean, one obvious consequence of climate change is that according to the charming people who gave me dinner last night, it's always this sunny. Actually, you're praying for rain. So I was touched by that. You know, there have to be some upsides, don't there, to this whole challenge. But no, it's really rather fun. And for me, this is a wonderful opportunity to come somewhere which for me, and I think for many of my generation, was a beacon, this place. And when I was at Cambridge in the mid-70s, we rather arrogantly linked the city with Ballymena. With Corrymeela. We didn't actually ask them. We just did it. And we had a whole big exhibition at the University Church, and we had walks through the processions and speakers and all the rest of it. I don't know to what extent it in any way helped you. But it helped us because rather like what we're facing now in terms of the scale and the challenge of the environment, for us, Northern Ireland was just incomprehensible. It just seemed so utterly beyond anything that we could do. And we looked for things that kind of gave us a doorway in. And I suppose it was one of the earliest points at which I realised that it's stories that save us. It's stories. Nobody was ever converted by a pie chart. Just doesn't happen. And I know that's a terrible shock to those who love statistics and data. And I spent my working life on the whole area of religion and environment. I'll tell you a bit about that in a moment. But when I became the founding president of Faith Invest, which I'll talk about a little bit more later because it's an extremely exciting development, which is dealing with the investment portfolios of the major religions. And people would say, so you know, what's your background in terms of maths? I go, well, I'm a theologian, so we spent the last 2,000 years trying to get 3 into 1 and 1 into 3. I still haven't succeeded. So can I pass on that one? And they go, yes, happily. But let me take you back a little bit here, because my background is that my father was a vicar, and he just knew that God was love. As simple as that. He lived his life for that. And my mother was a raving, rabid atheist who used to delight in I mean, they had a wonderful relationship, and my mother would come to church, but she would sit beside us or stand beside us, and when we were singing some dreadful Victorian hymn, she would psychoanalyze it, because she was a psychotherapist. And she would go, dear, all this blood stuff? Yes, mother. I'm about 13. She says, well, it's all fear of menstruation, basically. And I'm going, really, mother? What's menstruation? So, I grew up in a family where religion was debated and discussed and torn apart and put back together again. And I loved it. It was a wonderful atmosphere to grow up in. And then when I was 18, my parents and I mutually agreed that 6,000 miles between us would be a really, really good idea. So I went for a year, this is 1972, to work in an orphanage, children's orphanage in Hong Kong, which is where I learnt to speak Cantonese and to read classical Chinese. But to go at that very formative age into a totally, totally different culture. Though I didn't see another non-Chinese, another European, unless I decided to go into Kowloon, into the main area, or to go to church on Sunday. I just went inside this world, and it was fantastic for me, because I'd grown up. I'd never studied anything about China, and I went in '72 when I'd done my A-levels, and at no point in my school studies have we done anything on China. Not in geography, nor history, nor religion, nothing. It was a blank sheet. And it was such a wonderful experience for me, because it made me, although I had come back to being a Christian, if you grew up in a vicarage, you've got to be an atheist for a while, to just have some self-respect. But I wanted to do geology at A-level. Nobody else wanted to do geology, and I wasn't any good at languages and crap at science. So I said, well, what else can I do apart from English and history? He said, well, theology? I thought, well, that sounds similar. So I'd sort of gone into that to rip apart the synoptic gospels and prove it was all nonsense, and it didn't work. Something still spoke to me at the end of it. So I then studied theology, religious studies, and classical Chinese at Cambridge, and came out of that convinced that what we needed to celebrate was diversity. We actually need to see that the future will be pluralist. It always has been pluralist, it's just we've pretended that a particular belief system or ideology was the norm. My experience of being for a year in China taught me, no, because the Cultural Revolution was still going on, but I was deeply involved in communities that were Taoist and Buddhist, and Asian Christian, and I just thought, this is fabulous. I don't want everybody to agree. I want to be stretched, I want to be challenged. And so I then set up the first ever European multi-faith education centre. There were also multicultural centres that thought that religion was a kind of by-product or something about as significant as whether you liked a Chinese takeaway or an Indian takeaway. Whereas actually for the communities that they were patronising, faith was central. Absolutely central. So we created a centre for the schools. And we did a lot of work on the urban environment. I mean, particularly at that point, if there was anything about nature in any religious material, it showed a field with a stream and a tree. And I had a wonderful colleague who said, now you see why that field's so green? That's because they've used chemical fertilizers, which probably means that the stream is dead. And it was a wonderful deconstruction of this myth that really nature is something else out there that we could go and visit, not something that we actually inhabit. So I was working in inner city Manchester, and the Chinese had redesigned the area of Chinatown to reflect the belief that this was built on the head of a dragon, and that the cosmic forces of the rivers that were so polluted needed to be placated, and the whole design was for that. We also worked with the Muslim communities, and we looked at the way in which their lives and their buildings are orientated to a completely different geographical location. Or the Jewish community, and what do you do when you can only walk 1,000 paces on the Sabbath? What kind of community do you build around that? And how do you relate to the built environment? And because of this, I was approached by WWF, World Wildlife Fund, and they were in the process of trying to create educational resources for every section of the national curriculum. So geography, history, French, German, maths, etc., and religious education, of course. So I was asked to write, or done that again, to be the first ever book for schools on religion and environment. We called it Worlds of Difference. And we took Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, the Yanomami of the Amazon, Australian Aboriginals, humanists, and Taoists. And we looked at the way in which the story you tell about why we are here and why everything else is here determines what you think your role is. We are utterly shaped by narrative, even if we don't admit it. And I love dissecting government and international statements that claim to be science and fact-based. And you go, yes, yes, except that you think that the world began, everything, life began 4,000 million years ago, and I'm really sorry, but Hinduism says this is the most recent cycle of being, but there have been as many cycles of being as there are grains of sand on the banks of the river Ganges. So you're kind of almost talking biblically in terms of there's a set period of time and it all happened in that, whereas actually it's been going and not going and collapsing and coming again for countless aeons of billions of millions of years. So it's terribly sweet that you think that. But it may not be true. Or the time is linear rather than cyclical. So we live in our stories. Anyway, this book was published and it did very well. We sold 1.5 million copies in the end. It went into 8 languages. The really unexpected feature was that Prince Philip read it. Now at that point, Prince Philip was the international president of WWF. And as you know, he was a man who liked a good argument. He read my book. We published it in 1983, and he went to a meeting of WWF's International Committee, and they were planning their 25th anniversary for 1986. They'd already chosen the subject. It was going to be economics, it was going to be in Jakarta, they'd got the hotels, they'd got the speakers. It was November, the conference was in September, and Prince Philip went and he sat at the board meeting and he looked at the agenda and he said, well, I'm not coming. And they went, what? You're our international president, of course you've got to come. He said, no. And he said, look, let's be honest, if it was data that was going to save the world, we'd be doing it now. This was 1985. We've got the information. The trouble is, it's not actually touching us. It's not touching our hearts or our minds. Certainly not touching our souls. And he said, there have only ever been 2 forces that have really changed the way we see things. That's religion and art. And I've just read this book by this chap called Palmer. Why don't we invite the major religions to come and sell us what they believe and what they want to do to help save the planet? Well, if he had suggested that they should actually just sacrifice children on an altar, it probably would have caused less distress. Because this WWF loves to see itself as rational and scientific, which is why it has an animal that's eating itself into extinction as its logo, which is a purely mythological creature. And they only chose the panda, by the way, because in 1961, when they were founded, many of you here are old enough to remember the Gestetner, which you used to print off notices and leaflets. So they assumed that all the local WWF groups would print things off, and therefore it had to be a black and white animal. That's the only reason they had the banner. It's how you create new myths. So anyway, so he then suggested we do this. So I went to see him up at Sandringham just after Christmas that year. My first meeting with the Royal, and I had no idea what to do. I was slightly alarmed by the gentleman, the head of WWF at the time. Very strange character, WWF International. We were on the train up to Sandringham, and he was being very patronising. He thought I was going to tell Prince Philip it was a bad idea. No, I wasn't. and he disappeared into the loo. Oh, fair enough, okay. And then he came out, and he said, I'm guess you can't, I imagine you can't guess what I've just been doing. Sign on the door's a bit of a giveaway. She said, look. He polished the bottom of his shoes so that when he knelt, I didn't kneel. So I had this amazing meeting with him. We designed this event where we were going to bring the major religions together, which was going to be Buddhism, Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, and Islam, which is only 5 you could remember. And we did it. We held this big meeting in Assisi in 1986. And it was the first time ever that the major faiths had come together with the world's major environmental groups. Every major environmental group was there. Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, WWF, Nature Conservancy, Sierra Club, UNEP, as it was just, well no, it had been coming to being in the 70s. UNDP, World Bank, all kinds of, anybody that was dealing with environment was at that meeting. And we had the 5 faiths, and they produced 5 separate statements. Because the push from WWF was, would they all sign one statement basically agreeing that WWF is the solution? And in fact what emerged was that many of the faith groups found WWF to be part of the problem. Because it was locked into a Western paternalistic, racist, colonial model. So the Africa Commission of WWF International did not have a black African on it until 1997. So you were dealing with a culture that was trying to heal the problems of which it was in fact a manifestation. So it was quite a challenge to WWF. They didn't quite know how to do this. But we had the 5 religious communities there, plus we had a challenge from the indigenous communities, a Maori traditional challenge to Prince Philip as he came into the event in the Basilica. And that was very successful and got the biggest publicity WWF had. And so I was then appointed to be religious advisor on the environment of Prince Philip, which occasionally was a wee bit like being etiquette advisor to Attila the Hun. But the meals were very good, so it was quite complementary. But actually he was amazing. He backed this. He put his own personal authority to say, if we aren't working with the largest section of civil society that there is, why aren't we? What are we so frightened of about groups that have stories that might be troubling to us and also troubling to them because we're asking them to think about the consequences of some of the archetypes and language that we use. And it was relatively successful. It was very successful, in fact. And out of it came a sort of partnership. And then by 1995, Prince Philip had said, actually, you know, I think we just need to set up our own group, because WWF was finding it more and more difficult to work with the religions, because they're all, thank you so much. I'll try not to be too enthusiastic on the table. And by that stage, we had got the Baha'is, the Sikhs, the Jains, and the Taoists had signed up as well. And so we created the Alliance of Religions and Conservation, which gave us the splendid acronym of ARC, which of course worked wonderfully with the Abrahamic faiths. And when I would go to the Sikhs or the Taoists or the Shinto or the Zoroastrians and go, they go, because it wasn't part of their mythology. And that's also another important reminder. The shorthands that we use are entirely culturally determined. And we sometimes don't realise the degree to which we're using language which alienates others. I'll give you one very simple example. We have had a big programme working with the faiths as forest owners. About 5% of all the commercial forests in the world are owned by faiths. Far more importantly, 15% of the world's of the planet is considered sacred. And because it's sacred, it is better protected than the areas that aren't. So my area of expertise in particular is China. We did an audit between 1995 and 1998 of the 9 great sacred mountains of China, 4 Buddhist, 5 Taoist. And we were able to show that where there was religious practice still on the mountains, the biodiversity was infinitely more better protected and flourishing than where they had been removed and the temples turned into karaoke bars, which is not a joke. That's actually what happened. So we had all these groups together, and we brought together in 2006 some of the major forest-owning traditions. So Anglicans, Catholics, of course, Shinto, Buddhist, Hindu, Jain, I can't remember what else. And at one point, we were working very extensively with the Maronite tradition of Lebanon, which is an Orthodox tradition, but in relationship with the Pope. And around their sacred sites are the last remaining oak forests on the eastern Mediterranean coast. And we developed a whole program of Maronite protected forest. And in a moment of great enthusiasm, they said, why don't we just dedicate and say all our forests are faith-protected forests? And the vast majority kind of went, yeah, well, that's a nice idea. And the Shinto went, So I said, sorry. He said, well, this is ridiculous. I said, no, please explain, what do you mean? Well, we don't protect the forests. They protect us. What nonsense are you talking? So, one of the things I suppose I've enjoyed most is that I've had to rethink just about everything I ever thought. So that's what we did. We created, Canard had two roles. The first role was to get every major religious tradition in the world to come up with official statement on the environment, and then as a result to have activities that came from it. Because when, in 1985-86, Prince Philip asked me to go around the world and find out what the faiths were already doing, there were 3 religious environmental projects in the world faiths. By that I mean explicitly to tackle environmental issues. The fact that churchyards or shrines or pilgrimage routes were considered sacred often meant that as a byproduct they protected a habitat, but deliberate action. There were 3. There was a Buddhist project working with Tibetan refugees and with Thai forest monks. There was a Rosha. All credit, there was a Rosha the year before. And then there was the project that we'd done in the UK on creating materials for school education. That was it. So nothing else. The UN now estimates there's 1.5 million faith-based environmental programs in the world. And it is the largest section of civil society action on the environment and has been noted as such for the last 10 years since Paris in 2015. So it's been a big shift. And so part of it was to get every faith, and we've got now over 700 such statements from different traditions about where they stand on the environment, and that's led to them doing at least some degree of environmental action. And that's very good. I mean, there's lots of exciting stuff that's been done. One of the big ones would, I suppose, be solar panels. So every major, and in fact most minor, Buddhist and Taoist temples in China are now solar powered, and that was a policy decision made by the 2 associations, the China Taoist Association and the Buddhist Association of China in 2000. And they applied it, and it's been done. So, you know, there's that. In Africa, particularly working with the Muslim and Christian traditions, we were able to revive something that was always there, which was the notion that when you had some major event, you planted trees. A birth, a marriage, an initiation rite, passing an exam, surviving a drought, burials, etc. You planted trees as thanksgivings. And from that basis, we've been able to help develop, first of all, tree nurseries on Muslim and Christian lands around the mosques and the churches, right across, certainly in West Africa, East Africa, Southern Africa. But also, there was then the byproducts, the fact that could then generate income. It could also do water purification programs, and so it rolls out. So we've helped plant 1 billion trees through the faiths in the last 20 years in Africa as part of that contribution. and so on. Many, many things like that. I could give you many stories. But the other part was to get the major secular groups to take religion seriously as a partner. Because the attitude towards religion was, oh, we're scientists. We're not so foolish as to believe in those stories. We just believe in our own foolish stories. Superiority and power and right and might and all the rest of it. Because we all live in stories. Get over it. It's not a weakness, it's the only way we function. We function through stories. I once was asked, I was the first person ever asked to speak to the National Geographic Annual Conference on the environment in Washington, D.C. The first person to talk on religion. And I knew it had been massively opposed. I was the most unpopular guest they'd ever had. So I go there, I get there 24 hours before, and I'd listened to some fairly dull presentations, I have to say. But, you know, bless them, that's part of their culture, isn't it? You know, I have a wonderful friend of mine who was an Assistant Secretary General of the UN who said, "Do you know why numbers are called numbers? Because they're numb." What was I saying? Oh yeah. So anyway, so I there 24 hours, and I get up, and I could feel the hostility. So I said, "Ladies and gentlemen, delighted to be here, but can I just say how incredibly disappointed I am in all of you." And they said, no, we're disappointed in you. You're a leftover. You're something from, you know, from antediluvian times. I said, in 24 hours, I've talked to many of you. I don't know. None of you have told me how old you are. None of you have told me how much you weigh. None of you have told me how many calories you have for breakfast. Yeah, absolutely useless. You've told me about your granny who used to go to chapel. Or you've told me about your lover who is a devout Buddhist and meditates, and how that's had to be built into your whole way of thinking and so forth. Or you talk about how, you know, you've been so inspired by a particular religious leader, or by occasionally, you know, reading the Quran if you're a Muslim, or your father would take you through the forest in Indonesia and say, "Look, here is the second book of the Quran." You've told me stories. They then decided that they would make a film in which I would tell stories, and it never quite happened. But the interest was there. So anyway, we had succeeded in our goals, and when Prince Philip and I set up ARC, we agreed it would have a terminus ad quem, we would finish. And we gave ourselves 20 years. We went over by a couple of years, but we closed because we'd seen so many NGOs and charities come into being for very good reasons, and then go on being in order to go on being. And we didn't want that. So we set a terminus ad quem. But when we closed, we had done one thing during this. He and I had done an audit of what the faiths owned. Nobody had ever done this before, and we published it, first of all in 1997, and then a revised version in 2007, and we're working on a new edition now. That doesn't mean, by the way, I'm channeling Prince Philip from beyond the grave. I've got other people working with me on it. And he only pops in occasionally. And when he wants to complain about Harry. So we did a survey. We audited the faiths. And we found out that 50% of schools are related to faith in some way or another. Either run by them, or managed by them, or funded by them, or in a collaboration. Working with UNICEF, we found it was 64% of schools in sub-Saharan Africa, and the figure, that was a survey we did with them in 2012, it's now risen to 72%, because as governments collapse, they give back education to the faith, because the faith will be there in 300 years' time. There's no government that's going to be there in 300 years' time. They run a third of all universities. They run more than a third, much more than a third of all medical facilities. And when I say run, what I mean by that in most cases is on behalf of communities. They're not running it primarily for themselves, although that has been a flaw, but then that's not unique to faith. But they have been there for hundreds, if not thousands of years doing that. They also own or help manage 10% of the habitable surface of the planet. And that's quite significant too. That includes an enormous amount of forestry, agricultural land, and urban sites. And they are the fourth largest investing group in the world. Probably $13 to $14 trillion worth of the investment world is owned by the faiths. On top of that, the relationship between being an investor and being a person of faith is far higher per country than is the number of people who are officially a member of the faith. Because you've grown up with a tradition that this is for the future. This is for your children. This is not yours, it belongs to God, etc. Okay, you've kind of assumed God thinks it's okay if you're totally rapacious, an absolute bastard in terms of the people you pay, but, you know, in the end you're hoping it'll be all right on the grand day because you gave a little bit of money to the church. But it is a factor that there is a faith dimension which is latent in many of those investors. And so, when we closed ARC, Prince Philip said, and it was a lovely phrase, he said, look at all these statements. Why are they not recognizing their stakeholders? Why are they all running around saying, you've got to do this, you mustn't do that, you've got to put your money here, you've got to do this? Jesus had something to say about that. It was something to do with a beam in your eye and a speck in other people's eyes. And one of the problems of religion is that we love being against things. Or to be more precise, the Abrahamic faiths like to be against things. And so when we began the work on the assets of the faiths, we said, we know what you're against. What are you for? And if I see any hope at this moment, where we have so much data and information coming upon us, and by the way, I attended as a member of the Shinto delegation, the Kyoto COP in 1997. And we all knew what the problem was, and we all knew there had to be drastic plans. And we'd done the carbon output tally, and then we were betrayed. We were betrayed by the Americans. There are some quite because they then subverted the entire thing by finance. And they said, great, so if Guinea-Bissau has the same carbon level as we have in the United States, and they're not using it, we could buy it. And then we could keep going with what we're doing anyway. It was the most fundamental betrayal of human society collectively there has ever been. Because we shouldn't be coming towards COP29. It should have been over at COP7. But instead, we did something which we had a reformation about in Europe. We created the sale of indulgences. Carbon trading is the sale of indulgences. I don't want to give up. I'm a Palmer, and Palmers, we have a very honourable relationship with religion. My ancestors, let's say that Alex here is a somewhat unpleasant lord of the manor somewhere in England around 1400. Hard to imagine, but just project on it for a moment, can you? Okay? And any staff here, you may not need to project. So, Alex goes to see his father confessor. The father confessor says, Alex, given what you've done, you're going to have to go on your knees by pilgrimage to Jerusalem to repent. And Alex goes, yes, oh, sorry, I'm so sorry. She just looked so lovely and the money was so easy. So he would come out to that meeting, and then he would send out for one of my family, and we would be paid to go on pilgrimage for him. And we would tell him it's going to cost him so much. And our evidence that we got to the Holy Land was we came back with a palm leaf, Palmers. And if you read your Romeo and Juliet, you'll see that when they first meet, they play lots of games punning on the name of a palmer. And knowing my family, I suspect that what we actually did was we got as far as Santiago de Compostela, stayed for 4 years, then went round the back of the cathedral where there was a store where you could buy palm leaves. And then we came back and we said to Alex, oh God, it's horrendous. And he said, is it really? Going, yeah, you are. The Chinese have invaded and it's costing us 10 times as much, so sorry, it's going to cost you even more money. So my family have been trying to make money out of religion for 500 years. So far, we have failed. So there is, but that's what carbon trading is. It's the sale of indulgences. And what we're confronting with all this marvelous education and information and knowledge that we have is the incredible ability of human beings to go round, to miss the point, to not notice, to turn it into something that can be bought and sold. So that's why one of our major areas, and I'll finish with this, is we work with the major investment houses of the faiths, and we've now got, after 5 or 6 years, we've got about $100 billion worth of religious investment that has said it wishes to move. Now, this is not, delighted with the disinvestment campaign, but honestly, that's just more of what we're against. The big question is, why aren't we putting our investments into finding the alternative energy solutions that means we don't need fossil fuels? Stop preaching, practice. That's fine. But somebody else is going to buy those shares and they're going to have much less conscience than you are. And where are you putting that money? So we've got this major shift happening, what's called faith-consistent investing, and the Vatican's deeply involved in this, and others. Our problem was there weren't enough projects for them to invest in. Because you don't just throw your money into something and say, well, they said it's going to be really successful. Corrymeela is going to build 14 high-rise hotels. And it's going to be unbelievable because there'll be a small chapel in the basements near the end, the heating unit. And they'll make huge sums of money and they're going to be really, really nice to the trees. No, you've got to do due diligence, particularly when you're talking about millions and billions of dollars and pounds and all the rest of it. You've got to be sure that it's going to work and that you're also going to be able still to maintain what that investment funds, which is very often the social infrastructure of communities, the welfare work, the education work, the care for those who nobody cares about, working with refugees, working with the elderly, etc., etc. And so we have created a new partnership with the Green Climate Fund. Now, the Green Climate Fund was established just before the Paris COP in 2015, and its job is to move money from the developed world into the developing world as investments for adaptation and mitigation. In other words, it's not saying we can stop what is already happening. The question is, what do we do to deal with it in a way that can perhaps be a cause for celebration? And so that's what we're now working. We've created at the beginnings of a multi-faith just transition fund because transiting from fossil fuels to electric cars creates new injustices. And if you don't think that's happening, you're living in a dream world where as long as it's an electric car, somehow the world has been saved. Well, talk to the miners in the Congo, talk to the miners in China. You're wrong. So it's much more complicated. So what we've got to look at is where does that money go to make substantial infrastructure, social changes that are social and just. So when you're telling a community that has dug your coal for the last 400 years, they are now redundant and obsolete and you don't need them. No, that's not a just transition. How do you fund a just transition? The faiths ought to be the powerhouse of it, and they are beginning to move that way. But at the same time, with Green Climate Fund, they came to us and said, we love this idea of the investors, and we'll work with them, and we're setting up mechanisms for projects to come from the faiths, for investment by the Green Climate Fund, and also the FACE coming in blended finance with state governments and with the funds that the Green Climate Fund has. But to my door, they said, we want to work with the FACE, we want to set up a program with the FACE, and we want to set up a program with the arts, and we want to set up a program with faith media. And I said, whoa, okay, because the head of it had been to a couple of my events, and I always have actors, musicians, comedians, dancers, poets at my events. And on one occasion, she was in the States, Mafalda, and we were doing a conference, and we zoomed her in, and she could talk to us initially, and then we couldn't hear her anymore. So the point was we were going to announce the creation of this multi-faith just transition fund. So the crucial moment where she was going to say, and we will now back the multi-faith just transition, she died, the voice went. So there was a lot of confusion. I said, no, it's okay, it's okay, it's okay. In the religious traditions we do chanting. Yes? No. Yes? Oh, really? Okay, she's promised $10 billion to fund this. So she said, I want fun. I want laughter. She said, we are dealing the whole time with people who are telling us it's hopeless, it's ghastly. We're dealing with eco-fear. We're paralysing young people. We don't excite them about the future, we terrify them about the future. She said, we have to get to reach people beyond just the economics we do. So they're now funding with us a whole program with the arts, and a whole program on working with religious media, faith media around the world to get stories out of the communities into the wider circulation. Most of the international agencies don't know what's happening on the ground. And there is a great deal of wonderful stuff. So, if you despair, and there are moments where we all do, remember that one of the greatest gifts that the faiths have brought to the environmental movement is the notion of celebration. And when we've been opposed by groups who say, there's nothing to celebrate, our simple answer has been, if it isn't worth celebrating, why is it worth saying?
Thank you, Martin, very much. And thank you again for agreeing to take some questions. You may want to take a moment just to think about what you've heard. If there is a question that you might want to raise.
It's a meeting of Quakers.
Yeah. Corrymeela, you will not have a problem with it. Yes. Right.
The relationship with food security and climate, FAO, we know the UN has got its own dimension. What have you seen with that, or what in climate obviously drives population shifts now more than ever? But if you could just speak to that, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, we work very closely with the United Nations Development Programs, investing in nature-based solutions, which is essentially a program that looks at what can be done working with what nature does anyway, rather than ignoring what nature does. So a classic example would be that the model for forestry of the last 150 years has been monocrops, cut, sell, plant more monocrops, cut, sell, which degrades the soil, which reduces the habitats and so forth. So one of the big programs that we work with is agroforestry. So a classic example would be the EcoSeek, which is the big Seek environment program, has planted, I think they're up to 1,000 new sacred woods, sacred forests across India, other parts of the world, South Africa, and in Britain and Europe, which are using an extraordinary technology of rapid growth, particularly on damaged, on brown, sort of, what's it called? Industrial. Brownfield, thank you, brownfield sites. And that's been their particularity, has been to go into those. And those have then created both employment in terms of managing these sites. They've just finished planting their millionth tree in 4 years. and they survive. Their survival rate is 90 to 95%. But also what they do is they then build around that agro products where the forests actually protect the crops because they give habitat for particular kinds of bees or wasps which protect. But also they create jobs. They create the ability to have fuel, they create food supplies, etc. And that's spreading rapidly. We've worked a lot with helping the faiths move to organic farming. So we have 4 centres around the world where if a faith group wants to shift its farmland into organic, they can go and study, and that's funded by a combination of Shinto and Buddhist groups. So that's a big area. We've also helped promote a thing called Farming God's Way in sub-Saharan Africa, which is phenomenal. And we created, with our Muslim colleagues, Islamic farming. These are basically programs. Farmers are very traditional. And if you can show that this is what their Bible or their Quran actually was saying you should do anyway, you help them to hear and accept and work with new models of sustainable agriculture. And that was first developed, the Muslim one was developed first in Kenya and then has now gone to Bangladesh and other places. So in many cases it's also about returning to traditions of sustainable use and sustainable composting that were scrapped because the government would offer you, a subsidy if you took chemicals, and then they withdrew the subsidy and you were addicted. So in many cases what we're dealing with in agriculture, well, I've got friends who are in this work because they used to work on drug dependency. And they say it's exactly the same thing. It's exactly the same thing. You're dealing with the fallibility of human nature, which is always an easy solution. And then you're hooked. So we do a lot of that. Again, on the forestry, virtually all the religious forests are now FSC certified. That was a program we began in 2000, and that's mostly been successful. And then the other side is that the faiths are massive purchasers of food. So we've also said, what is your purchasing policy? We estimated with the EAT Foundation based in Norway, who produced the EAT Lancet report, and the new one is out this month actually, I think the end of this month, on sustainable agriculture. So we've worked very intensely with the groups that, in a sense, can say not only how to grow it, but also what you should buy. And we estimated with EAT that the faiths supply 500 million meals a day. The Sikhs alone, through their Gurdwaras in India, feed 23 million people a day. Now, if they then have a purchasing policy for organic, sustainable, free range, whatever the criteria is, you create the market that then drives the desire for farmers to shift to that market. So we've done that in the UK. All the major religious places like Wesley House in London, which is the Methodist International Central Hotel, the Quaker Meeting House with its cafes, most cathedral cafes, etc. They've now come together and they have a common purchasing policy. Interestingly enough, WWF, with whom I've worked for 45 years now, 40 years or so, did not have an ethical purchasing policy until 4 years ago. And when we used to have our trustees meeting at ARC, we used to have to insist that the food had been properly sourced. And it was like talking, it was as though, what's that got to do with saving the planet? You think, everything. So there's a lot, but the scale is enormous and it's slow. And there is, one of the things that I have had to deal with in the past is that I can't tell you how many meetings I've been to in the last 45 years where I've been told we've got 5 years. It's rubbish. It's absolute rubbish. And it's bad psychology. I mean, we've had apocalyptic groups in the churches who said, yes, the Messiah will return on the 2nd of July, 1897. And he didn't. So they moved the date. There's nothing new in this. It's how we deal with crises. We come up with fake information. give us a sense of, now you've got to decide, you've got to join us, because look, otherwise you're going to go to hell. So it's bad psychology. But the faiths are long-term. The Swedish church we work with very closely, their head of investment says, I invest for eternity. And she means it. And there's a lovely story, common to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, of someone is planting a tree. And someone comes rushing to them and goes, Halt! Halt! The Messiah is coming! Or the Messiah is returning! Or the Imam is returning! Come now! Alex will finish planting the tree. Then you'll go and see if the Messiah has come.
Thank you very much for that question. The food insecurity is, I know something you care deeply about, Frank, and also there's a partner in Michael D. Higgins, the President of Ireland. And that.
Yes.
Other questions? Yes.
Martin, this is a gathering where we're talking about justice and a just transition. The work that you're doing around the world is fantastic, so that's really hopeful. Could you say a little bit more about some of the recent court challenges? Australia against the minister and Germany against some of the companies that are contributing to pollution? Did you hear?
Yeah, very much so.
Anyone hear that?
Thank you, because I think one of the things that I've witnessed, I work very closely with Ecocide, the organisation that is now on the cusp of getting the majority of UN nations to agree that ecological damage that kills habitats is a crime. Because at the moment it's not a crime, you can be told off. So as in Australia, if you blow up an aboriginal sacred place for a mine, you know, you might give you some bad publicity, you get your knuckles whacked and may have to pay some money, but you won't actually go to court. You may not be locked, well, you won't be locked up for it. So ecocide is one of the areas that the faiths are very much involved in, very much supporting. I think the other issue, and that raises a very, very interesting theological, philosophical question. What are, and I won't use the word rights, what are our duties to the rights of the rest of life on earth? Because at the moment we still function in the West, in the Abrahamic traditions, with the sense that it's all here because of us. Well, that's nonsense. We're probably going to be the shortest lived species ever. I love the trilobites. I love collecting trilobites. Trilobites were around for 250 million years and then they died out. I think we'll be lucky if we make it to 100,000 years. So the thought that we're why it's all here is the most supreme piece of arrogance. Or that it's here for us to manage for ourselves. Another supreme piece of arrogance. No. Yes, there are texts that you can point to, but if I'm looking at the Bible, go to Job. Go to Job 39, where God is a wee bit pissed off with Job. And he just goes, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Do you know how the hind gives birth? Do you know where the badger lives? No. So who are you to talk to me? I think the challenge that we're facing is, how do we actually live with the fact that other species have rights if we have rights, and that we have duties and they have duties? How do we have a mature relationship which isn't just based on management? And I think from the faith perspective, I'm a great critic of the word stewardship. In my church, we have stewardship campaigns. And at the beginning of the campaign, the priest will get up and say, no, this isn't just about money. This is about your gifts and your skill and your time, and your passion and your energy and your enthusiasm. And 6 months later, it's about how much money you give. So stewardship is a managerial model. It's not a relationship. We need a sacramental relationship, and the Orthodox Church have a sense of a sacramental relationship in nature. Their teaching, and remember, they are the second largest tradition of Christianity. Their reading of the Bible is that we are simply yet gloriously the channel for God's grace to the whole of creation, and for creation's love, adoration, and reverence back to the Creator. We're a conduit. We're not the purpose, we're not the goal. We're just there, that the whole whole of creation can be in relationship and loved and treasured and held by the Creator, and we have a useful role to play.
One or two, we will keep the time. Ferdy?
Yeah. Thanks very much, Martin, for, I think you're, is that switched on? Not better? No?
It's not, I think you're okay speaking, to be honest. Can everybody hear?
Okay, I'm trying to talk loud. So thanks very much for your talk. I'm hoping that maybe it brings a lot of us out of our boxes that we're in. I'm sort of thinking that. But I have this question, having listened to one or two of your talks before, and you just began to touch on it. So you've had, I'm thinking, you've mentioned before, and you're touching on now, that we're not actually stewards on the planet. And I was wondering, I mean, it says in the Bible that we've set in the garden to work and so on. From the Quran, that we have a responsibility, and that God will hold us accountable if we don't look after the earth. I understand to some extent that, or at least I think we have to some extent, we have a purpose, although we are not the purpose. But you've mentioned there a role. Do we not have a role while we're here on this earth of what I would call stewarding or playing our role as part of the creation? And for most of us, that translates as stewarding because of the impact and influence that we can have as a species.
I would go back to what the Shinto said at our conference. You don't protect the forests.
Yeah.
They protect you. You don't protect the rivers. They protect you. You don't protect the air. The air protects you. What's this arrogance of thinking that we're managing it well? Or that that's what we're here for? Because if so, we should resign now. Because we've fundamentally screwed it up. So no, I think it's a very damaging model. It's a managerial model. And part of our problem, and this is where particularly when I'm looking at the investment portfolio work, one of our challenges to the faiths is, at what point does the return that you need to keep supporting the work you currently do mean that the way you invest is contributing to an economic and a political system that is predicated upon use and abuse? Because if you can't tackle that, get out of the scene. So what we look at, we have a no growth principle. We have a principle of sustaining the income coming in from faith. But no, I genuinely believe that we have failed to grasp the scale of what we've done. It's rather, Graham Greene had a wonderful phrase about the prayer of confession in the Book of Common Prayer, my tradition's book. And he said, it's the old lad up before the bench again, saying, honest, I'll never do it ever again. I'm a reformed character. Please, give me a break. That's what we're doing. We're not actually changing. And we give ourselves these myths of superiority. Well, we're not superior. The most recently evolved thing is a kind of earthworm. Not us. So let's put ourselves back in the box and look at this again. And the fact of the matter is that half of the world does not sees stewarding as the problem, because they've been stewarded by colonial organisation. They've been stewarded by multinationals. They've been stewarded by fascism or communism or capitalism or Christianity or Islam or even Buddhism has been. So no, we've got to look seriously at the language we use, because for many people it is alienating.
Certainly. What would you say the role of our species actually is then?
I think it's exactly what was being raised here. How do we find a place within life on Earth? Half of our problem, if you look at most of the scientific studies, the language is of observers. We are observing what is happening to the climate. we are observing what's happening to the rivers. We're observing what is happening to the land and the soil. No, we're not. We're not outside it. We're in it. And until we begin to talk about us in the soil, and us in the water, and us in the air, we're going to be looking at it as a managerial, well, we're out here, and frankly, the rivers are not doing terribly well. I mean, this is wonderful. I mean, yes, this is because they're polluting up there, but we're not passive. And our danger is that by putting it out there, we are thinking that somehow we either have the knowledge or the ability or the role to be in charge. Actually, I think a lot of this is humility, and I love the United Nations Development Programme, nature-based solutions. Not economic-based solutions, not human-based solutions, nature-based solutions that then provide a livable habitat. So, no, I'm vehement on this because I think it's one of the myths we tell ourselves, and it's a dangerous myth.
Thank you. The conversation continues over coffee. You want to join me in thanking Martin. This conversation about the connection between our faith and our work and our being on this planet. The stories that we tell can save us, they can also lead us down a very dangerous path. So be careful about those stories. I am very mindful of the fact you used World Wildlife Foundation as one that did not realize how tied up it was with colonial practice, and Western Christian Church is another organization.
Oh, no, you're right.
Yes, tightly bound with that. As we go off to coffee, you'll go to the main house, coffee, tea there. Back here.